Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and in today's episode, I'll be speaking with John Holodnak, co-founder of Occam, about how AI is beginning to reshape career paths across the life sciences. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Nicole. It's great to be here.
So I'm going to let John introduce Occam in a little bit, but it goes without saying that today we're going to be focusing on AI and, in particular, how it is changing functional roles in the life sciences, such as clinical ops, regulatory, market access, commercial, and business development. So, John, over to you. And first of all, I was wondering if you could briefly introduce yourself for our listeners and describe the journey that led you to doing what you do today.
Sure. No one ever sets out to become a recruiter, I'm pretty sure. And that applies to me. I was a liberal arts major, studied French, ended up on Wall Street, became a commodities trader here in Manhattan, and was radically unfulfilled in some ways. It was at that point that my father, who is a veteran recruiter who had started his own search firm within Fidelity Investments and grew it orders of magnitude across multiple continents. He was at a point where he was retiring and needed to reinvent himself. I went to business school to do the same. We ended up coming together about 14 years ago and deciding to go into league together to start what has become Occam, a family recruiting business focused on the venture capital and private equity communities and their many children, which is to say their portfolio companies that are typically cutting edge, high science platform companies, somewhat early in their existence, which is when we come in and recruit at the C-suite and board level and persist with these companies through their evolution, typically into public market existence.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, John. So just to sort of make it slightly clearer for our listeners, Occam advises boards, CEOs, and investors on executive hiring and leadership strategy across biotech, pharma, and emerging life sciences companies.
That's right. We recruit across both the R&D and commercial continuum. So a lot of CMO and CSO work, and obviously on the commercial side, chief business officers, chief financial officers, chief operating officers, and then a lot of CEO and board work as well.
So, what have you been hearing from the boards and the CEOs about how hiring priorities are shifting in 2026, John?
It's all now about augmenting asset value and generating revenue. Uh, Large addressable markets and chronic disease states, big indications have become very much of interest, like obesity, of course, which we're all probably hearing about ad nauseum. This has been in favor of traditionally popular indications like rare disease. What else has happened? High science platform companies have become punished, I think, with the market reversal following biotech's what I like to call peak celebrity moment in COVID with the Moderna vaccine. Since then, there's been backlash in all kinds of ways, and companies that were trading on big promises and really groundbreaking science, but had very little in the way of clinical progress to show for it. Those companies have really struggled. And the shift has turned much more aggressively towards platform companies, ideally, though, platform companies only with clinical stage assets. And so the way that translates into my business of recruiting is fewer CSOs and more CMOs, fewer CFOs, I would say, a lot more CEO work and board work as well. And the CEO recruitments are always the most daunting, I would say.
Why is that? Can I ask why?
So the venture set typically prefers, in their mind, the most de-risked asset, which is the serial CEO who's delivered multiple successful exits for investors. Now, of course, the risk with this phenotypic category is, do they have the juice to roll that particular rock up the hill again? Because it is an arduous and punishing job, I would say, being CEO. And the answer is typically not. Once they've had a successful exit, they typically then want the VC's job. And so increasingly, we have to look to first-time CEO candidates, and that's really, I think, where things get exciting, because you've got to identify the star on the rise rather than the known quantity. And we really help, I think, in evaluating intelligent risk assessment around these types of candidates. And a funny thing, maybe not funny, but I liken it to a lot of these venture boards want to recruit Julia Roberts when she was in Pretty Woman. And I always argue, you want Julia Roberts when she was in Mystic Pizza, before she was a blockbuster celebrity and she was on the ascent.
That's an interesting analogy. We might come back to that later in this conversation, John. Before we got onto the considering of the rolling the rock up the hill analogy, and basically fatigue with having already done the grand job, you were mentioning words like punishment and backlash and even an aggressive shift towards platform companies. So I wonder, with this terminology, are companies still in a defensive mode, or are we seeing a new growth posture?
I misspoke, or I wasn't clear when I said there was a shift toward platform companies. It's a shift away from platform companies toward clinical stage assets. However, platform companies that also have clinical stage assets, those are still beloved.
And as for the punishment and the backlash?
I think that AI-enabled drug discovery in particular had largely been inert from a lot of the market purge that focused on more traditional biotech companies. But the Grim Reaper eventually came for AI-enabled drug discovery, because I think up until that point, AIDD had traded on big promises, massive biobuck deals with big pharma offered a certain degree of protection. But with the market turn, all of a sudden it became all about delivering the goods, which means putting programs into the clinic. And that, I think, has caused AIDD companies that were in the early days promising to be a panacea, that is, fully integrated drug discovery and development companies. It's shifted now. Those were the sexy companies. Now the sexy companies in AIDD are actually the boring ones. The ones meaning that focus on automating a very particular, discrete, quantifiable part of the R&D continuum. And oftentimes these are fee-for-service companies. And in the high markets, investors in AIDD did not want to hear fee-for-service. That was like a dirty word. And now that expectations have been brought down to earth with respect to what AI can do now, companies that are generating revenue, providing a service, these are companies that are doing very well.
Can you go further into the capabilities that are non-negotiable now, John?
I would say the most coveted of all virtues is managerial prowess. Now, I'm a student of philosophy, and Plato, as you may know, argued that no one under 30 should study philosophy. And I think what he meant is, until you've been abused by the world, it's very difficult to develop a frame of reference to understand not only yourself, but how the world works at large. I think the same is true of great management. People who are able to be broad generalists, integrative leaders, who understand certain functions, maybe not all functions, but have an intellectual openness to what they don't know. I think these kinds of qualities, psychological maturity, the ability to kind of influence and engender trust with investors, the ability to hire and lead and motivate super smart people across disciplines. These are kind of the very human capabilities that will never go out of fashion and will actually, I think, become even more paramount in a world that's becoming increasingly more computationally driven.
So, how is AI beginning to affect or reshape that process when it comes to that great managerial pool?
I mean, there are ways to skip the queue in terms of responsibility and title. Traditionally, the career path that has been revered by industry and biotech even has looked a little something like this. Maybe begin in management consulting, Bain or McKinsey, get a broad general business education, or it could happen on Wall Street. These are usually where these people start their career. They then migrate to pharma in operating roles and ascend either to the general management level or through that track, or the head of R&D track. And it's at that point where typically they're identified as being, talking to my earlier conundrum with recruiting CEOs, very likely first time CEO candidates. I think with AI, the rules of the game have changed a little bit. Not changed, but they've become more blurred. And careers that are more messy, more improvisational, no longer are regarded with circumspect, but with reverence in a way. And in the CTO role in particular, I like to cite a guy by the name of Lindsay Edwards. He's the CTO of a UK-based AIDD company called Relation Therapeutics, and placed Lindsay at Relation. But what excited me so much about Lindsay was that he had a totally wild background. He's in a former life, he was an accomplished professional musician. He was the keyboarder for the Corrs, which I don't know if you know. Do you know them?
Yes.
Yes, and I thought that was only I'm one of the few people in the U.S. who know them, but I know they were big in Europe. But anyway, Lindsay had not an insignificant amount of commercial success as an artist. He then is also an avid cyclist and was very curious about learning how human biology could improve his cycle time. So he delved himself into the mysticism of biology in really with real focus and intent. He also learned how to code because he loved electronic dance music, and being able to synthesize beats. He needed how to understand how to manipulate zeros and ones, I guess, to a degree. But all of this experience converged and became a self-taught machine learnist, coder, biologist, and he's wildly impressive and imaginative and creative. And I think in the past, our employers would have regarded someone like Lindsay as being too outside the norm to be of value. But in this new world, where AI is really upending everything and creating chaos, people with perfectly crafted careers often are a little bit brittle. They haven't experienced failure in the ways others have. They haven't taken risks in the way guys like Lindsay have. They weren't purely, and not in all cases, driven by intellectual curiosity. It was more monochromatic ambition, bigger jobs, bigger titles, that kind of thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. But Lindsay, I really think, is an artist, and all of which is tying this back to AI, upending how everything's happening. I think there's much more reverence for guys like Lindsay who can be real polymaths and think integratively about how other disciplines think about the problem, because it's all different. Biologists and chemists think about things totally different than the technologists. And a guy like Lindsay, who's got sensibilities that span, both left and right side of the brain, to use a cliche, these kinds of synthetic intelligences are really valuable in recruiting for AIDD companies, because I would just say that the technologists who are hyper specialized and super smart, oftentimes they don't regard management as on the intellectual level of what it is that they do, which is solving quadratic equations. But management and recruiting is complex and naughty in different ways. And the founding technologists that we work with who start companies that have self-awareness and humility in that way, they are the ones that augment themselves the best. And I think that will increase their chances of success radically. But I'm biased, of course.
Well, a lot to unpack there, John, but you took the word out of my mouth. Polymath indeed, as pertains to Lindsay. So you've been discussing this blurring of the linear paths of yore and this need really in today's landscape for that creative spark, that sort of artistic notion that sees beyond the bounds of the box, as it were. So you spoke earlier of this desire for, to go back to that analogy, Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman, as opposed to Julia Roberts in Mystic Pizza. Coming back to AI and its ability perhaps to compress career timelines, does this mean that younger professionals can move into leadership faster because of this tech leverage? You did mention the sort of historic step by step of the ladder before, but how is that like tangibly changed, and how is it going to further change with the acceleration also of AI itself?
I think that there are ways to move into leadership roles maybe a little bit more expeditiously, provided that whatever technologist is ascending into more general leadership roles, they understand they understand and appreciate how important it is to be able to speak many different languages, to be emotionally intelligent, to be able to communicate both written and through speaking. I mention that because these are such radically analog qualities, but there's all this talk of AI doing everything. But unless you've got the artist at the helm, and by artist I mean someone who can not just be technically sophisticated and intellectually curious, but also be able to really understand what it takes to lead and motivate people. And I'm going to reverse myself here, but I'm not sure there's a way to leapfrog or compress those managing complexity, because it comes through hard fought experience. So I'm not sure if I concur with that notion of AI enabling people to kind of skip levels.
No, it does become very philosophical, and clearly you're going to erring on the side of Plato there. So, what can we sort of wrap it in a neat bow for today's conversational purpose? What can we suggest, or rather you yourself, John, suggest for those ambitious professionals who are listening in today? What should they be doing in 2026 and beyond to future proof or indeed promote and progress their careers?
I mean, as Thomas Aquinas said, you've got to go against your natural bent. This has always been something I've lived by, and I think it applies more broadly to many classes of executive humanity, but in particular the CTOs, the technologists, the ones who are very AI heavy. They've got to seek to become more adroit at reading between the notes, being able to play, jazz more than classical music, to improvise, to play with ambiguity. Hyper specialization, I think it's great to be the best at something. I think that's very valuable, but it can be limiting too. I think in ascending the leadership ranks, you've got to find ways to broaden yourself. And if that means if you're in the R&D function, find ways to pivot within the organization to get closer to commercial, to business development, even if you don't intend to stay there. But finding ways to broaden your own equation beyond just what you're really good at, I think will help distinguish you. I think it will help develop you more broadly as a person and future manager, because the technologists that, again, coming back to the same thing, that are really valuable are the ones that, of course, have domain expertise, but they don't have to be brilliant. What they do have to be brilliant about, though, is understanding how to work cross-disciplinary and getting disparate disciplines to work well together. And so becoming fluent, or at least becoming engaging in dialectical conversations with the biologist, the chemist, the wet science side of the house, the more that you can be able to kind of absorb how they think, how they operate, the better I think the whole relationship will be. And that applies too for the people on the wet science side. They can't be dismissive of computation. They can't think biology and chemistry are so mystical that computational people, machine learners, can't possibly be able to help them or understand them. So it's very important that communication happens across both sides of the aisle. And communication can only happen if you revisit, some of the more classical elements of education. I feel, I used to be ashamed being a liberal arts person. I now am so proud of it, because I think being a generalist now more than ever is increasingly more valuable.
I
I'm
100%
sorry
concur.
for that long-winded answer.
Not at all. It has been a delightful, perhaps slightly rambling, but in its rambling quality, really quite revealing. And I think our listeners today, John, will very much appreciate your stream of consciousness. So thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Nicole.
And that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments, at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your other podcasts from. Just search for pharmaphorum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.